Dust rose in lazy spirals as the sun crept over the flat horizon, painting the wide prairie in shades of pale gold and pink. The small ranch sat at the edge of this endless land, its fences leaning tiredly after another season of hard wind and sparse rain. Inside the modest house, a young rancher tightened the worn leather strap on his boots and prepared for another day of work that would stretch from first light to well past dark. His name was known in town, not for wealth or position, but for the way he kept going when others gave up. The years had taken his parents, drained his savings, and left him with a herd thinned by drought, but he refused to abandon the soil that had shaped him. Each morning began the same. The rasp of flint against kindling, the slow hiss of water heating on the stove, the quiet creak of the barn door as he stepped into the cool dawn. He moved with a purposeful calm, checking the cattle, mending the fences, hauling water from the well. The work was relentless, yet he found a strange comfort in its rhythm. The land asked everything of him and gave little in return, but it was honest. Here there were no false promises, no easy escapes, only sweat, grit, and the hope that tomorrow might bring a better season. What the land did not give was companionship. Years of labor had left him strong and capable, but loneliness pressed in like the heavy summer air. Neighbors lived miles apart, and though he occasionally rode into town for supplies, he kept mostly to himself. Friends had married and started families, while he built a life of solitary endurance. He told himself it was fine, that love was a luxury he could not afford when every coin went to feed and seed. Still, in the quiet moments after the day's work was done, he felt the hollow ache of evenings spent alone, the silence of a house where no other voice ever answered his own. On a late afternoon heavy with the scent of dust and dry grass, he set out for the nearby town of Red Creek to buy grain and a few tools. The trail wound through open pasture where the wind bent the tall grass in slow waves. He rode with the easy posture of a man used to long miles and his own company, his mind already turning over the endless list of repairs and debts waiting back home. But as he neared the town, a sound carried on the wind that broke his quiet thoughts, a restless murmur of voices, sharper and more insistent than the usual market chatter. The main street of Red Creek was crowded when he arrived. Wagons lined up along the dusty road and horses tied shoulder to shoulder. People gathered near the wooden platform at the center of town, their faces flushed with heat and anticipation. He dismounted and looped the reins around a hitching post, curiosity stirring despite himself. As he moved closer, the smell of sweat and old timber mingled with the low hum of conversation. Above the heads of the crowd, a crude sign hung from the platform announcing a labor auction. He had heard of such auctions before, families crushed by debt selling contracts for work, sometimes for years, to anyone with enough money. It was a practice he despised but could not stop, a harsh reality of frontier life where desperation often outweighed mercy. He was about to turn away when his gaze caught on a figure standing at the center of the platform. A young woman, no older than 19, stood beneath the fading banner. Her dress was simple and worn, its faded fabric brushed by the evening breeze. Though the dust clung to her hem and the sun burned her cheeks, she held herself with quiet dignity. Her eyes, dark and steady, scanned the crowd with a mixture of fear and defiance. She clasped her hands tightly before her, the knuckles pale against the coarse fabric, as if holding herself together in the face of a humiliation she refused to show. A whisper from a nearby bystander reached his ears. The girl's parents had died the previous winter, leaving her in the care of relatives who valued money more than kinship. Unable or unwilling to support her, they had arranged to sell her labor to the highest bidder. The rancher felt a slow burn rise in his chest, anger mixing with an unexpected surge of protectiveness. He had known hardship all his life, but the thought of a young woman treated like property struck deeper than he could easily explain. The auctioneer stepped forward, calling for bids with a loud, practiced voice. A man near the front shouted a number, drawing a ripple of interest from the crowd. Another called out a higher price, his eyes sliding over the girl in a way that made the rancher's jaw tighten. The young woman stood motionless, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the horizon, refusing to react. She looked like a tree standing against a storm, fragile in the wind, yet rooted in an inner strength that no gavel could break. The rancher's heart thudded with a question he could no longer ignore. He thought of his lonely ranch, of the empty rooms where only the echo of his own footsteps kept him company. He thought of the girl's steady eyes and the injustice of her being bartered like a sack of grain. He had little money to spare, yet the idea of turning away left a taste of ash in his mouth. His boots seemed to move of their own accord, carrying him through the press of bodies until he stood near the front, close enough to see the faint tremor in her clasped hands. The auctioneer barked out another bid and scanned the crowd for more. The rancher felt the words gather in his chest, rising like a tide that could not be held back. When he spoke, his voice carried clear and firm over the restless murmurs, naming a price that silenced the laughter and drew every eye in the square. The girl's head turned slightly, her eyes meeting his for the briefest instant. In that quiet exchange, something passed between them, a spark of recognition, a fragile understanding that neither of them could yet name but both could feel in the charged air of that dusty town square. The crowd seemed to tighten around the platform after his bid, a sudden hush falling over the restless chatter. The auctioneer, a thin man with a red face and quick eyes, scanned the gathering with exaggerated patience, waiting for another voice to rise above the silence. But no one spoke. Men who had shouted prices moments earlier now stared at their boots or adjusted their hats, unwilling to challenge the quiet authority in the rancher's steady tone. Dust drifted lazily in the warm air, catching the late light, as the pause stretched long enough for everyone to feel the weight of it. Then the gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed off the wooden storefronts. "Sold," the auctioneer declared, his voice rough but final. A ripple of murmurs followed, part surprise, part disappointment. Some of the onlookers muttered about the price, others about the man who had dared to speak so decisively. The young woman remained still, her posture as straight as when the bidding began, but a subtle change passed over her face. It was not quite relief, not yet, but the tightness in her shoulders eased as if a heavy rope had loosened. She allowed herself a single breath, quiet and controlled, before the rancher stepped forward. He moved with a calm purpose that parted the crowd without a word. His boots stirred small puffs of dust as he climbed the platform steps, removing his hat as he reached the top. Up close he saw the exhaustion etched into her eyes, the stubborn strength that had carried her through a nightmare of public humiliation. He felt the anger rise again, sharp and protective, but he forced his voice to remain even. "Miss," he said softly, offering the respectful address of a man who knew how quickly a name could be misused. "You're free of this. You don't belong to me. I only wanted to stop what was happening." She looked at him, eyes wide but wary. The world had not given her many reasons to trust a stranger, and he could see her weighing every word. He kept his hands at his sides, careful not to crowd her. "I own a ranch a few miles west," he continued. "It's not much, but it's honest. If you need a place to stay, you're welcome to work there until you decide what comes next. You'd be safe." Her lips parted slightly, as if to speak, but she hesitated. He could almost hear the storm of thoughts behind her steady gaze. The humiliation of the auction, the fear of falling into another trap, the fragile hope that perhaps this offer was different. He took a slow breath and added, "There's another choice. Marriage. If you marry me, no one can sell you again. You'd have the law on your side. I'd give you my name, but not my demands. You'd be free inside it. No harm will come to you from me. That's a promise." The words settled between them, heavy and astonishing in their simplicity. He expected her to turn away, to retreat behind the shield of caution that had kept her alive. Instead, she studied his face with a quiet intensity, searching for the lie that so many others would have hidden behind polite smiles. All she found was the straightforward gaze of a man who had nothing to offer but hard work, a weathered home, and the unpolished truth. The auctioneer cleared his throat impatiently, shuffling papers and muttering about contracts. Around them, the crowd began to disperse, their curiosity satisfied. A few women lingered at the edges, eyes soft with something like sympathy. The young woman finally spoke, her voice low but steady. "Why would you do this for me? You don't know me." He tilted his head, considering the question. "Because someone should," he said simply. "Because you deserve the chance to choose your own life." Her eyes flickered, a fragile light breaking through the guarded surface. She glanced at the crowd, at the faces that had once been potential buyers and now turned away in search of other amusements. Then she looked back at him. "If I come with you," she asked carefully, "I keep my freedom." "You keep everything that's yours," he answered without hesitation. "Your work, your choices, your voice." For the first time since he had seen her on the platform, she allowed a small breath of relief to escape, a sound so soft it might have been mistaken for the breeze. She nodded once, a gesture of cautious acceptance. "I'll go with you." He felt a quiet release in his chest, not triumph but a deep, steady satisfaction that he had managed to protect something precious from the rough trade of the day. He offered his hand to help her down from the platform. She placed her palm in his, her grip firm despite the tremor he sensed beneath her composure. Together, they stepped into the street, leaving behind the fading noise of the auction and the cruel calculations that had brought her there. The late sun slanted across the town, throwing long shadows over the wooden storefronts as they walked toward his horse. People turned to watch, some whispering, some nodding in silent approval. He ignored the stares, focusing instead on the young woman at his side. Each step seemed to loosen the invisible chains that had bound her, each breath carrying her further from the life she had been forced to endure. When they reached his horse, he untied the reins and turned to her with a small, reassuring smile. "It's a long ride," he said gently, "but the road is quiet and the sky will be clear. Are you ready?" She looked past him toward the open prairie where the fading light touched the horizon with a soft glow. The wind lifted a strand of her hair and carried it across her face. She brushed it back and met his eyes. "Yes," she said, "I'm ready." With that simple word, the day shifted. The crowd behind them dissolved into a blur of noise and dust, and the wide land ahead opened like a promise. He helped her into the saddle, careful and respectful, before mounting his own horse. Together they turned toward the western trail, the setting sun painting the sky in streaks of orange and rose. The first stars were already beginning to appear, small points of light guiding them away from the cruelty of the town, and toward a future neither of them could yet imagine. But both were willing to face side by side. The prairie stretched wide and endless as they rode away from Red Creek, the town shrinking into a blur of wooden roofs and drifting dust. The air felt cleaner beyond the edge of the settlement, carrying the scent of dry grass and the faint sweetness of late summer sage. The young woman sat straight in the saddle despite the ache of unfamiliar riding, her hands steady on the reins. Each step of the horse carried her farther from the cruel platform, where strangers had measured her worth in dollars, and each mile loosened the tight knot of fear in her chest. The rancher rode a short distance ahead, his posture easy but alert, glancing back often to make sure she was comfortable. When their eyes met, he offered a small nod of reassurance, a quiet reminder that the road belonged to them now and no one else. For a long time neither spoke. The rhythm of hooves and the cry of distant hawks filled the silence, a language older and more honest than words. She let the sounds wash over her until the pounding of her heart slowed and the weight of the morning began to lift. The vastness of the land seemed to draw the fear out of her, leaving space for something unfamiliar, something close to hope. She had left the auction with nothing but the clothes on her back, yet she felt lighter than she had in months. The thought startled her. Freedom, it seemed, did not always require possessions. Sometimes it only needed distance and the steady presence of someone who refused to treat her as a bargain to be claimed. Eventually he guided his horse alongside hers, matching her pace with easy skill. "We'll stop at the creek ahead," he said, his voice low and steady. "The horses need water, and you'll want to stretch a bit." His words were practical, but there was a quiet gentleness beneath them, the kind that asked nothing and offered everything. She nodded, grateful for the pause and for the way he spoke to her as an equal rather than a charge. When they reached the creek, the water shimmered in the slanting sunlight, cool and clear against the parched earth. He dismounted first and held the reins while she swung down, his hand steady at her elbow but never possessive. They led the horses to the water and knelt to drink from cupped palms. The cold stream shocked her dry throat and cleared the lingering haze of fear. For a few moments they sat on the bank in companionable silence, watching the current twist around smooth stones. He broke the quiet with a simple question. "Do you have family anywhere?" She hesitated, the memories rising like sharp stones beneath still water. "No one left who would take me in," she said softly. "My parents are gone. The rest, they were the ones who brought me there." He nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the creek. "I'm sorry," he said, and she believed him. There was no pity in his tone, only a quiet recognition of loss. He tossed a pebble into the water and added, "You don't owe them anything. Not anymore." The words settled over her like a warm blanket against the cool breeze. For the first time she allowed herself to imagine a life unbound by the demands of others. She studied his profile as he watched the water, a face weathered by sun and wind, lined by years of hard work, but softened by a steady kindness. He had risked money he could barely spare to stop the auction, not for profit but to give her a choice. That knowledge tightened something in her chest, a mix of gratitude and the cautious beginning of trust. After the horses had drunk their fill, they mounted again and continued west. The landscape changed as they rode. Low hills rose from the plains, dotted with clusters of cottonwood trees whose leaves whispered in the breeze. He pointed out landmarks along the way, a patch of wildflowers that bloomed in spring, a ridge where deer often grazed at dawn. His voice carried a quiet pride as he described the land he worked, the creeks he had dug by hand, the seasons that tested his resolve. She listened closely, not only to the words but to the love hidden beneath them. The ranch was not just a livelihood, it was a living part of him, a place where every fence post and furrow bore the mark of his endurance. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in streaks of amber and rose, he slowed his horse and gestured toward a distant rise. "My place is just beyond that hill," he said. She followed his gaze, her heart quickening at the thought of the life waiting on the other side. The horizon glowed with the last light of day, and for a fleeting moment she felt as if the earth itself was guiding her toward something more than survival, toward a home she had not dared to hope for. They reached the hilltop as twilight deepened, the air cooling with the promise of night. From there she caught her first glimpse of the ranch. A modest house stood near a cluster of cottonwoods, its chimney sending a thin thread of smoke into the darkening sky. A barn sat a short distance away, weathered but strong, and a small corral stretched beside it where a few cattle grazed in the fading light. It was no grand estate, but it radiated a quiet solidity that stirred something deep within her chest. This was not the cold house of her relatives or the barren platform of the auction. It was a place shaped by care, by honest work, by the steady will of the man who now rode beside her. He watched her face as she took it in. "It isn't fancy," he said quietly, "but it's safe. And it's ours now if you want it to be." She did not answer right away. Words felt too small for the surge of emotions rising inside her, relief, gratitude, and a cautious excitement that felt dangerously close to joy. The wind tugged gently at her hair as she looked from the sturdy house to the man whose steady courage had carried her here. For the first time since her parents died, she felt the stir of belonging, as if the land itself whispered that she had reached a place where fear could finally loosen its hold. The final stretch of the ride carried them down the slope toward the cluster of buildings that would soon shape the rhythm of their days. Evening settled over the prairie in slow, rich layers of color, the sky deepening from rose to violet while a soft wind moved through the tall grass. The young woman breathed in the scent of wood smoke and damp earth as the ranch came closer, every detail sharpening against the twilight. A split-rail fence framed the yard, its posts worn but sturdy. Beyond it stood the barn, weathered to a silvery gray by years of sun and wind. The modest house glowed with the faint light of a lamp, the warm flicker spilling through the windows like a silent welcome. They halted at the gate, and the rancher dismounted with the easy grace of a man who belonged to this land. He tied his horse to the rail and came around to help her down, his hand steady beneath her elbow. She slid from the saddle, boots touching the packed earth of the yard with a soft thud. For a heartbeat she simply stood there, taking in the quiet strength of the place. It was not grand or polished, but it carried the unmistakable imprint of care, each fence mended, each tool stored with deliberate order. After the chaos of the auction and the restless miles of open prairie, the stillness here felt like a balm. Inside the house the air smelled faintly of cedar and smoke, the scent of a home that had weathered many seasons. The rancher struck a match and lit a lantern, filling the main room with a soft golden glow. She followed him across a floor of worn pine boards to a sturdy table flanked by two simple chairs. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean, a small stack of wood neatly arranged beside it. Shelves lined with jars of preserved fruit and dried herbs spoke of long winters endured with quiet preparation. He set the lantern on the table and turned to her, his eyes steady in the flickering light. "This is it," he said, his voice carrying both pride and humility. "It's not fancy, but it's safe. You can have your own room if you like. Tomorrow we'll ride into town to settle the papers from the auction. After that, whatever you decide, work or marriage, you'll have a place here until you're ready for the next step." The simple generosity of the words stirred something deep inside her. She moved slowly through the room, fingertips brushing the smooth surface of the table, the warm stones of the fireplace, the rough weave of a blanket folded neatly on a wooden chest. Every object spoke of effort and endurance, of a life built by honest work rather than cruelty or chance. She thought of the cold house she had left behind, the sharp voices that had traded her dignity for money. Here, for the first time in many months, she felt no shadow of threat. He showed her the small bedroom at the back of the house. A narrow bed stood against the wall, covered with a quilt faded by years of washing. A single window looked out toward the cottonwoods, where the last traces of daylight shimmered through the leaves. She set her small bundle of belongings on the chest at the foot of the bed and stood quietly, listening to the gentle creak of the house settling around them. He lingered at the doorway, hat in hand, giving her space. "I'll be out in the barn if you need anything," he said softly. "You've had a long day. Rest if you can." After he left, she sat on the edge of the bed and let the quiet wrap around her. The sounds of the ranch drifted through the window, the distant low of a cow, the soft whinny of a horse, the rhythmic creak of the windmill turning against the evening breeze. Each sound was a reminder that life continued here with or without her, steady and unhurried. She removed her shoes and stretched her aching feet, feeling the rough quilt beneath her palms. The weight of exhaustion settled over her, but it was a peaceful fatigue, the kind that followed movement toward something better. Later, drawn by the soft glow of lamplight, she stepped back into the main room. The rancher was seated at the table, a ledger open before him, his brow furrowed in concentration as he tallied figures with a worn pencil. He looked up when she entered, his expression easing into a faint smile. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. She shook her head, unsure how to explain the restless thoughts that kept her awake. He gestured toward the empty chair. "Sit a spell. Sometimes the quiet makes it easier to think." She joined him at the table, the warmth of the lantern chasing the last chill from the room. For a while they spoke of small things, the long ride, the stubborn mule that guarded the hay pile, the first frost likely to come before the month's end. The conversation flowed easily, each word smoothing the rough edges of the day. She watched the way the light played across his face, highlighting the strength carved by years of work and the surprising gentleness that softened his eyes. When silence finally settled between them, it carried no weight of expectation. They simply sat, two weary souls sharing the same pool of light in a house built from hard earth and quiet hope. Outside, the prairie night stretched vast and starlit, but within these walls the world felt smaller, warmer, and infinitely more possible. The first light of morning spilled across the prairie like a slow tide of silver and gold, washing over the small house and the fields beyond. She woke to the faint clatter of pots in the kitchen and the steady hum of the windmill outside, sounds that felt almost like a gentle greeting. For a heartbeat she lay still, listening to the rhythm of a place already beginning to feel like her own. The quilt beneath her carried the faint scent of cedar and clean air. Gone were the restless nights filled with fear of what strangers might demand. In their place was the quiet certainty of a day shaped by honest work and the soft presence of the man who had brought her here. When she stepped into the kitchen, the rancher was already moving about with calm efficiency. The fire in the stove glowed bright, casting a warm light across the worn wooden floor. He looked up as she entered, offering a small smile that held both welcome and respect. "Morning," he said simply. "Coffee's ready." Steam rose from the pot, carrying the rich smell of roasted beans. She returned his smile and joined him at the table, wrapping her hands around the warm cup he poured for her. They ate in companionable silence, the scrape of cutlery and the crackle of the fire filling the spaces where words weren't needed. After breakfast he showed her the day's work, leading her outside into the crisp air. The fields glistened with dew, and the sky stretched wide and cloudless above them. Together they began the chores, feeding the animals, checking the fences, carrying buckets of water to the troughs. He explained each task patiently, his voice steady as he demonstrated how to lift a bale of hay without straining her back, how to test the fence wire for weak spots. She listened carefully, eager to learn, and soon her hands found their own rhythm. The work was hard, but it carried a satisfaction she had never known before. Each chore completed was proof of her own strength, each step across the wide yard a small victory over the helplessness of her past. By mid-morning the sun climbed higher, warming the chill from the air. They paused by the barn to drink from the well, the water cold and sharp against their throats. He asked if she was tired, but she shook her head, a small smile playing at her lips. "It feels good," she said, surprising herself with the truth of it. He chuckled softly, a low sound that held a trace of admiration. "You're tougher than most," he replied, handing her another cup of water before they returned to work. The hours passed in a steady rhythm of movement and quiet conversation. They repaired a sagging gate, stacked firewood against the side of the house, and spread fresh straw in the barn stalls. He shared small bits of wisdom learned from years on the land, how to read the sky for signs of rain, how to calm a skittish horse with a gentle voice. She listened, storing each detail like a precious tool. The more they worked together, the more natural their partnership felt, as if they had been moving through these tasks side by side for far longer than a single day. When the sun began to dip toward the western hills, they finished the last chore and carried the empty buckets back to the porch. The house glowed in the soft light of late afternoon, its windows catching the fading gold of the sky. They sat on the steps for a moment, letting the breeze cool their faces and the quiet settle around them. The rancher leaned back against the railing, eyes half closed as he listened to the distant calls of birds returning to their nests. She watched the horizon, where streaks of pink and violet spread like paint across the vast canvas of the prairie. After a while he turned toward her, his voice low and thoughtful. "You worked hard today," he said. "You didn't have to, but you did." She met his gaze and saw not just gratitude but a deeper respect shining there, a recognition of her strength and her choice to stand beside him. Heat rose to her cheeks, though the evening air had cooled. "It feels right," she said softly. "Like this is where I'm supposed to be." He nodded, the faintest smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. They sat together until the last light slipped from the sky, the prairie fading into a quiet sea of shadow. Somewhere in the distance a coyote howled, its lonely cry carried on the wind. She felt the sound deep in her chest, not as a warning but as a reminder of the wild, untamed world beyond their small circle of warmth. And yet, sitting there beside him, she felt no fear. The loneliness that had once pressed in from every side now seemed far away, held back by the simple strength of their shared silence and the steady beat of a life they were just beginning to build. The following days unfolded with a quiet steadiness that wrapped the ranch in a kind of gentle wonder. Spring crept across the land, softening the ground beneath their boots and filling the air with the smell of thawing earth. Each morning she woke to the low murmur of cattle and the rhythmic squeak of the windmill, sounds that now felt like a welcome rather than a warning. The light through her window was different every day, sometimes a pale wash of silver before dawn, sometimes a bold sweep of gold that warmed the quilt and coaxed her to rise. With every sunrise, the house seemed less like a stranger's shelter and more like a living part of her own story. Together, they worked the ranch as if they had always shared the same rhythm. He showed her how to guide the plow through the first soft furrows of soil, their boots sinking into the damp earth as they moved in slow, deliberate lines. She learned to scatter seed with a careful hand, pressing each grain into the ground with the quiet hope that it would take root. When the sun climbed high, they rested by the creek, their reflections rippling in the cold water as they drank from cupped palms. Sometimes they spoke of practical things, when to repair the south fence, how many calves might be born before summer. But just as often they let the silence stretch between them, a silence rich with the comfort of understanding. Visitors began to appear now that the harshest cold had passed. Neighbors rode in with sacks of seed or baskets of preserved fruit, curious to meet the young woman who had arrived so suddenly and stayed without fanfare. They found her calm and capable, her eyes steady as she offered coffee and biscuits while the rancher added wood to the stove. Whispers from town had painted her as a girl rescued from misfortune, but those who saw her here spoke instead of the quiet authority in her manner, the way she moved through the house as though she had always belonged. When the neighbors left, they carried with them not a tale of charity, but a story of two people shaping a life with their own hands. As the season ripened, the land rewarded their effort. Tiny shoots of green broke through the soil in neat rows behind the house, each one a fragile promise of the harvest to come. She checked them every morning, kneeling in the damp earth to brush aside stray pebbles and marvel at the stubborn strength of new life. He often joined her, crouching beside her to point out the first signs of beans or the delicate stems of young corn. Their laughter carried across the yard when a sudden breeze scattered a handful of seeds, forcing them to chase the dancing grains like playful children. Evenings brought a softer magic. After supper, they often walked the pasture while the sun slid behind the hills, leaving streaks of crimson and violet across the vast sky. The cattle grazed quietly in the fading light, their silhouettes dark against the glowing horizon. Sometimes he reached for her hand as they strolled, his grip warm and steady. Other times he simply matched his steps to hers, the two of them moving in easy harmony while the prairie settled into twilight. The silence between them no longer felt like emptiness. It was a space filled with trust, a language deeper than speech. One evening, a gentle rain began as they returned from the far pasture. They paused on the porch, watching the drops glisten on the fence rails and listening to the soft percussion on the roof. The scent of wet earth and budding grass filled the air. Without a word he reached for her hand, the warmth of his palm a quiet assurance against the cool dampness of the night. She looked up at him, and in that unspoken exchange she felt the truth of all they had built. Two lives once shaped by hardship now joined in a partnership of choice and quiet devotion. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering light across the walls. She set a pot of coffee on the stove while he hung their coats to dry. They shared the small meal they had prepared earlier, the simple flavors richened by the warmth of the room and the sound of rain tapping steadily outside. Later they sat side by side near the fire, the glow painting soft shadows across their faces. He told her stories of the ranch in years past, of storms weathered and calves raised. his voice carrying the pride of a man who had wrestled life from a stubborn land. She listened, her head tilted slightly, eyes reflecting the dancing flames. As the night deepened, the storm eased to a gentle drizzle. The ranch lay wrapped in darkness and the clean scent of rain. She leaned back in her chair and let the warmth of the fire seep into her bones, her thoughts drifting over the day's work, the laughter in the garden, the quiet strength of the man beside her. The walls that had once held only silence now pulsed with the shared heartbeat of two people who had found, against all odds, a place where fear could not reach and loneliness had no claim.